Do you have a website, an external presence, employees, an office? Any of these things can be compromised and attacked. How are you defending these assets? Have you penetration tested these public assets? Start 2017 by taking a proactive approach to securing your vulnerable areas. Black Hills Information Security has been helping companies find their weaknesses since 2008. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com and see how they can help you sleep better at night. Welcome back, everyone, to Startup Security Weekly. Michael, when we talk about, and I liked how Todd, numbers-wise, kind of described small business, small, medium business, and mid-market as a company between 100 and 200 people. I think it's pretty much the sweet spot there. I would almost go down to 50 people. Having worked for a company of about 50 people when I started my career, we certainly had some of those same challenges. We were a software company too, so we had some of those same challenges. So I would kind of drop that down to 50. And then I like small enterprise at 1,000 to 2,000 because I think you start having more enterprisey problems at 1,000 to 2,000 people, right?
Yeah, and I think too, if we look at what's traditionally been enterprise and enterprise grade types of solutions, you can get those now on a subscription, and you couldn't do that 5 years ago. You certainly couldn't do it 10 years ago. And so I think that's an interesting point, is that some of those things have shifted, right? I mean, we always talk about how the landscape has shifted and the technology has shifted. We frequently, no surprise, look at startups on this program. And what have we looked at? In fact, one of the articles we're going to talk about in this segment, it has shifted. And what we're seeing now is things that we did 10 years ago, we're doing them different now. We're calling them different because the landscape has shifted and changed. So yeah, I think it's interesting to look at that. And I always wonder, do we look at headcount and size? Do we look at revenue? Or do we just look at functionality of the problem that's trying to solve? And so it's always interesting to see how somebody who's in that space and is looking at it is handling it and how they're doing it. And it's exciting to see somebody going after that marketplace because we certainly know that the attackers are. So it's good.
And I like how you termed it as subscriptions are available now, because IT Pro TV has a subscription, which is where I was going with that. And I'm glad we put that context around it, because if you're in that small, medium-sized business mid-market or small enterprise, IT Pro TV certainly has a play there with the supervisor portal. And you probably, if you're in a very small IT team, maybe you're the only person. That's a great use case, Michael. I remember being the only IT person for the company of 50 people, and sending me away for training for a week was a big deal because I wasn't there. Now I was getting training on managing the version control system, and that was important, but there's always new things to learn, and you can't always be away from the office when you do it. And I like also having other employees being able to get up to speed on different technologies. So I think the subscription in the market that we're talking about, and the larger enterprise too, but certainly in the small, medium-sized business, mid-market, small enterprise, it's very applicable. And you should definitely check that out.
Yeah, let me just build on this because, I've been really impressed with the work that IT Pro TV is doing. And when you go take a look at it, one of the things that Todd said, and again, there was a lot of really good information in there. Some of it maybe a little nuanced because he just kind of made it so matter of fact. But he said, start with a desk side or a table side chat with some of the executives. So think about that. If you're in any of those situations, because this is going to work, anybody. If you want to make sure that you're up to speed on the particular topic and maybe look at it from a couple of different angles, one of the things that I've enjoyed about the IT Pro TV approach is, we'll give you some blue team, we'll give you some red team, we'll show you what that looks like. You can get yourself up to speed very quickly and then go have a good conversation with somebody else. You don't necessarily have to use the jargon, but you'll understand enough that you can have that confidence. And if you can go have that conversation confidently, that goes a long way towards expressing why you need to do something, why it's valuable, right? All the stuff that we tend to talk about. So yeah, I think those are good choices.
I like that. Use IT Pro and have confidence in your role in the organization. It's fantastic, Michael. What do we got to talk about today?
Well, we're gonna continue on these ideas around leadership, innovation, and success. This one was kind of interesting, and I reread a lot of these this morning, getting ready for today. So it's getting to the critical few behaviors that can drive cultural change. We talk about this a lot in security. And so that's kind of why I threw this one in here. It's always about, right, it's the culture, it's the security culture. And there's a lot of times when I hear that, it's kind of like nails on a chalkboard, because I always look and I go, okay, what are you talking about? What does it mean? The reason I like this article then is it says, okay, hold on. you can only really change like 3, maybe 5 behaviors. Now that's interesting because we talk about that in marketing. We talk about that in communication. We talk about that in, well, just about everything. It's a pretty good universal that if you can just get down to the 3 most important things, the 3 critical behaviors that you need in order to get that change, you're going to be in better shape. Okay, cool. How do you do that? Well, this will come as a shock. You first have to figure out the problem you're actually trying to solve. But what I liked about this was it talks about the 5 whys. Now, if you've done the workshops with me, or we've even talked about it here, I think it's a great, simple way to start getting a better handle on the problem you're trying to solve. So it's got some examples in there. So if that's something that you've dabbled with, or you've tried to understood better, well, look at me go. You got your opportunity there. But then you have to say, okay, so what are what they call keystone behaviors? What's the behavior you really have to change, and start there. Like that's where you start. So a lot of times what will happen is we look at the outcome. We look at, well, if people just did this, we'd be better off. And what this is really saying is, okay, if you want to influence change in your organization, go figure out how people are doing it today. And then based on what they're doing today, figure out the one change that you need to make that gets you closer to where you want to be. And they lay out a bunch of really good criteria here in terms of thinking about it. So is it actionable? What's your degree of visibility? Can people see other people performing the behavior? Think about that in terms of the group dynamics and risk and personal risk. Can you measure it? How fast do people get results from doing it? How easy is it to implement? When we start looking at behaviors and changing behaviors, and we look at learning and anything else, the quicker we can get somebody through a process where they can gain an insight and reflect on it and have safety because other people have done the same things. By the way, you're going to see that come up when we talk about Google's insights on Teams. Well, if you can go figure out that behavior and just focus on that, just one, because I know they said up to 3. Frankly, if you could figure out the one behavior to start on that does those things, you can measure it, people can see it, they get results, they're excited about it. Cool. And then what's the next behavior, right? You stack them.
I think it's important for everyone to see the importance and the benefits of measurement. And oftentimes I will change a process so that we can measure it better, and that just benefits everyone. You don't always like see the whole thing, all the way through to the, you don't see the result at the end. And, Michael, you and I were talking this week, and one of my mantras lately is to get as much as I can out of email, out of spreadsheets, and into some process and system that we can measure it more effectively. And the benefit of that is that we can make changes that makes everyone's lives better. We can make changes that make our customers and partners' lives better, right? Makes the host lives better. And just everyone has a better experience. And I think a lot of that hinges on changing a process so that you can measure it better. I think a lot of that for me right now is getting stuff out of email so we can track it.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating how important that becomes, right? So it's looking at that process. But what's neat is if you think about it, what did we start talking about? Well, what problem or what problems are we trying to solve? And then we say, okay, well, what do we have available to us today? And it turns out there's a wealth of information on it. Cool. Well, how are we using that? Where's that getting us? And what are we able to measure? What I found fascinating is measurement's really elusive in our industry, and it has been for a long time. And we usually, well, Michael, security's hard. Here's the thing. If you're trying to measure, especially behavior change, the best advice I always give you is measure the outcome. Measure the outcome of the behavior. So, for example, this is an old example, but people are still doing it. If you think you have a password problem, and I hate that overall as a concept, but let's just say you do. I'm going to say, well, how do you evidence that? And if you come back and you say, well, password resets, people have to call the help desk. It's $10 per reset, and it's a problem. Okay, cool. Well, which groups are more problematic than others? Oh, I don't know. Well, start there. But when you decide on your course of action, you're going to measure the outcome. Well, go measure if the help desk calls went up or went down. Now, other things you can do with passwords. You can measure the strength, right? You can grab whatever your favorite cracker ripping tool or grab your rainbow tables. But instead of just saying like how many can you break, what's the median time to break them? What's the mean time to break them? How many did you break? Okay, well, now after you go and you do some sort of a training program for people on passwords, okay, well, how many went and changed their passwords right away? How many changed them within 24 hours? Did they categorically get stronger or weaker, or could you discern a difference? There's so much stuff we can test, but to your point, you've got to say, okay, well, what's the process look like? part of it's the what do I need to test, and part of it's how can I, and then are we? And I think that's some of those challenges. But if you want to change your culture, if you want to shift behaviors in the organization, you can't do it all. And the other mistake I see is people assume, well, I told them what to do, so they're just going to do it. Not going to work that way. So I agree. I think the measurement, it's evidence, and evidence speaks volumes. People dig that a lot. So I like it a lot. On the same vein, this is concept of back channeling. This was an interesting article. I definitely think most of the stuff we put up here is at least worth skimming. This one's worth reading, and it was kind of interesting, and I hadn't really considered it fully until I read it a couple times. So this idea of back channeling, frankly, we've all done it, especially now with the proliferation of Slack and text messaging. If you've been in a meeting and somebody's talking and you're texting somebody else in the meeting and saying, oh, I wish they just shut up, or I really like that point, or no, they missed this point, or someone's got to say something about this, that's back channeling. Now that's live, that's real-time back channeling, but it's the same concept of going and talking to somebody else or getting it. What I hadn't previously deeply considered about this, Paul, is that when you have that back channel, what it does is it gives people that have a minority opinion or a minority perspective an opportunity to express that. So if you're in the majority, this is the way we've always done it, or this is the right course of action, the back channel gives that minority perspective a chance to surface. I mean, oh, that's kind of interesting. Well, it turns out as soon as somebody is aware that that back channel exists, the whole approach changes. And suddenly, because you're aware that there might be a different perspective or a different opinion on the process, instead of just trying to railroad it through, you slow down, you ask more questions, you engage more people. Just because they're going to do it anyway, because they have that avenue, the whole dynamic of it shifts. And so my takeaway from this is, I think it's, first of all, a great thing, because more perspectives and more dialogue tend to get us to better decisions faster. But you don't have to do much other than just acknowledge that people are going to use Slack, and they're going to use social media, and they're going to use chatting and email and lunch discussions and walks around the pond to talk about these things. And so just by acknowledging it and encouraging it, you basically change the whole dynamic in the organization. And I think it's really kind of cool. And they list out a couple different ways that they've tested it, and they've shown that it keeps working. So I thought it was kind of neat.
Awesome. The seed stage is now the seed gradient.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've been talking about this. So the real takeaway in this is looking at the downside of money. But just to kind of give you the overview to this at some level, and we're going to talk about this again in the next section too a little bit. The first thing I thought that was kind of interesting here is typically now if we see somebody who takes on a Series A now is oftentimes it's the fourth round of institutional funding that this organization has taken on. So they've already gone through an accelerator, a pre-seed, and a seed stage. So when we see a Series A, a lot of times it's not the first round of information. It's not the second round. It's not, okay, we made it, we're at our A. Like, there's already been a number of stages. But what's happened is it's all changed. So whereas once upon a time, if you had an A round that was under $1 million, that was pretty typical, right? We'd see $200,000-$300,000 A round, and we go, cool. Well, now we see A rounds span anywhere from $500,000 to, I think we've seen $15 or $20 million A rounds. Wow. Okay. Oh, okay. So their point is it's not a stage anymore. It's a gradient, and it's all over the place. So here's the stuff that they pointed out that I thought was really great. And Paul, you and I have talked about this a lot on this program. And so let me just point out too, this matters obviously if you're in the startup phase, but these are the questions, because I think part of what we can look at here, right? One of our guiding principles on this program is it's improving the security of business by exploring the business of security. So here's the thing. There's a ton of money out there. And we lampoon these articles every time. There's a contraction. No, there's not. There's more money than ever. And so the downside of more money than ever is it's pretty easy to get. It makes you sloppy. But there's the one that I really liked. This was probably my favorite part. And I'm going to go ahead and quote it. It's also the top highlight. When a startup is perpetually fundraising, they're ceding ground to competitors that are dead set on execution. Paul, I feel like you and I have talked about that for the last 18 months. Execute. Just go do it. Be really good at it. Be better than everybody else. And then if you need more money, take more money. The other part to it is, and I thought this was interesting, Many founders may argue that more capital lowers the personal risk of a startup failing, and it allows founders to make bigger bets. It also changes the mindset. They become employees. Yeah, and so it's just kind of interesting because basically, as you and I say, if you're going in for funding, take what you need in order to execute. And we're still seeing it's about a 2-year cycle. So take what you need in order to get through 2 years. By the way, have a plan. Know how you're going to use the money. And we call out the companies that take on their funding and say, now we can go do this. And you'll see, especially in the ones we showcase, it's matching up. Right? They're in a growth stage. They've got product market fit. They're in a growth stage. They took on a fairly large round, and they're going to use it to accelerate growth. Hey, what a surprise. And what we're starting to see is these ones that don't work so well, they took on funding, well, because it was good for their ego. And they weren't exactly sure what they're going to do with it. And they weren't really clear. And they were really good at fundraising, but that didn't translate into explaining the problem they were trying to solve in the marketplace. And that's, of course, we were talking about this at the top of our program today. That's where I think the Security Weekly network in total has a role to play, helping connect some of those dots together for people. So I thought that was kind of interesting in that, because instead of arguing whether it's seed or pre-seed or angel or whatever, how much money did you take? What problem are you trying to solve with that money? What problem does your product solve? And are you executing? Cool, do it. So I thought that was an interesting. There were some points in there I thought were made well that I liked quite a bit.
Sweet.
All right, positioning products as a set. This one was fun. This one I actually saved. I'm going to go back and pay attention to it again. There's this interesting concept. If we look at the state of productivity today, starting is easy, finishing is hard, but psychologically, finishing is fantastic. So if you study things like Kanban boards or visual ways of tracking your work, the idea of like a personal Kanban is you want to limit the amount of work that you have in process so that you get it done. And there's a psychological reward from getting the work done, so you end up wanting to get more work done. Well, it turns out that same thing applies to the way that we can influence behavior. And in fact, I'm going to go so far as to say I'm willing to bet we could do it to influence behavior in more ways than not. But basically what they looked at was, and I love this thing, they called it, I got to find it, pseudo set framing. Pseudo set framing. So what they did was they looked at the way that they bundled stuff together, and they did this test with the Canadian Red Cross, and they said, okay, if we tell you that you can just donate like normal, or that you can donate and gosh, thanks so much, and I'll give you a badge for these things we can do, or what if I tell you it's part of a global survival kit, and I'll show you how your contribution helps complete that kit? Well, what they found was people wanted to complete the kit. It didn't feel right if you didn't complete the kit. Or something, Paul, that us and our colleagues tend to be pretty familiar with. What if you got a 6-pack of beer, but there's only 4 bottles in it? How many bottles are missing? 2, right? By the way, if it's a 4-pack and there's 2 missing, how many will people put into it? 2. Why? We like completeness, and we like things to be complete. So there's 2 basic takeaways to this. If you want someone to take a particular action, think about how you're framing it. That doesn't mean that I should show you a case that, it's got 24 slots and there's only 6 in it, so you're going to buy 18. It may not work that way. But what happens then is that if we want somebody to complete something, we can start figuring out that sweet spot to where it feels completed, where they feel satiated, where they feel good with it. And if you think about that, if we can start figuring out insecurity, so whether you're a startup or you're running an enterprise team, if somebody has an interaction with you, does it feel complete? Do they feel good? Did you frame that in a way that they took an extra action, not 10 extra actions, 1 extra action? Oh, go connect this back to a behavior. Did you figure out how to help complete a critical behavior in a way that made sense to them, and maybe even offer them that next step, and they felt now compelled to take that too because it fit? I think you're going to find that there's a lot of success to it. Now, could it be misused or misunderstood? Of course.
Yes.
But it's just, the point to this was that they went and they did the research, and what they said was it's pseudo set framing. It's not like I said, well, you have to have this 26 volume set of Britannica encyclopedias. What I'm saying is it's the same options, the same outcomes. How you frame it makes a huge difference. That's the key point here. And that was, I don't know, I get excited about stuff like that.
No, I think that actually helps us in some of the conversations we had this week, Michael.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And people are going to see that as it starts to come through. And of course, we'll use this, and we're going to use it for good. And that's the way that it works. All right. So the last part, Google. I mean, look, I think you and I even talked at some point in the last couple of weeks on air about dark Google and people's concerns about it. But one of the things that I've been pretty impressed with is Google is consistently and almost relentlessly looking at what it takes to be a high performer and what it takes to have a high performance team, and they're willing to bring people in to talk about it. They're willing to take on projects. They're willing to share their research, and so this what I love about this is it just breaks it down. So Google went out. They conducted 200 interviews with employees. They looked at 250 attributes of 180 teams. So it's not a small data set. They went pretty good. And they came back and they said, okay, here's what's most important. And this is the most important. And we've talked about this a couple times already. It's called psychological safety. I know we have talked about it on this program before. And it boils down to this. Does your team feel safe taking a risk? Does your team feel safe expressing an opinion? Does your team feel safe expressing a contrarian opinion? Do they feel comfortable disagreeing with the team? If so, that's psychological safety. And if they can be vulnerable, if they can make that mistake, if they're willing or able to be embarrassed or wrong, that is going to be the number one predictor of success. And that becomes important in terms of the language that we use and how we communicate with each other, as well as the behaviors and everything around it. And then if you have that, so that's the number one. Second one is dependability. The third one is structure and clarity. To me, that one's really important. I find this is a really big challenge for startups. And I know people probably sometimes roll their eyes every time I say this, but I have to tell you, it's amazing to me, Paul, the parallels between startups and small, highly competitive vendors and enterprises. Because your enterprise security team, a lot of times, even if today you're going to say to me, well, but Michael, we've got 100 employees, right? So you're still small by a lot of standards. And 3 to 5 years ago, what'd you have? 25? So what happens with the structure and this clarity is, does everybody know what their role is? Is it clear? Do they have a plan for what they need to get done and how it's going to work? And do they have goals? What are they progressing toward? And it's astonishing to me how many times in the enterprise they don't know. We hand wave. Oh, I mean, I kind of know, maybe. I mean, how many bourbons have you had? I'll explain it to you. It'll sound good. And it's the same thing in the vendor side. If you don't have that, people don't know where they fit. And if we don't know where we fit, we're very unsettled. Number 4, looking for meaning. People want to have meaning at work. It's so fascinating to me. I mean, I think we're pretty good at this in security, and yet sometimes we lose sight of that. And we want to do meaningful work. There are very few people who truly just show up for the paycheck and go home. But then if you're a leader, whether you're in the vendor space or you're the enterprise leader, are you stoking that for your team? Are you sharing the meaning? Are you sharing that higher purpose? Are you getting people excited? Are you keeping them connected to that? And then go back a step. Does the structure and clarity then of your team match that meaning? Are people's roles, are their goals, are their plans, are they matched up to that meaning? Yeah? Oh, kick ass. By the way, I talk to a lot of leaders, Paul, who say, oh, yeah. And then I go talk to the teams and they go, I have no clue.
Different story.
Well, we're not quite there. So if your answer to that was, oh yeah, I'm on that. Okay, maybe you are. You could be that one. Somebody usually is, but chances are they aren't. So look, what I love about this is, I mean, I feel like Maslow probably could have told us this a couple hundred years ago, but the point is, it's there, and it's good stuff to think about, and it applies across our audience. So it's good stuff.
What's going on in startup news, Michael?
All right, well, I always try to throw in some stuff here around just the way that these things are happening, because again, and I've already said it today, so I'll keep it tighter this time. If you're in an enterprise today, or you're an SMB or you're mid-market, and you're evaluating a startup because you like their approach to the solution, right? As Todd said, they've come, they've talked to you, they're excited about something. I think it's important to be able to ask them about the stages of their funding and their growth plans and where they see themselves going. So this stuff is things that we're going to keep talking about. All right, so it's a pretty good article on Crunchbase, and it was talking about how, all right, so now there's this pre-seed, and there's a venture to it. Now, in the articles that we've talked about, so why do we have the pre-seed? And what kind of pulled up here was interesting was pre-seed is essentially what a Series A was a decade ago. So so you say, well, so what happened? Okay, well, I think a couple things happened. There's interest in the space, right, in startups overall. But we've talked about a decade ago, there was a major inflection point. The cost of starting up went down. Now, that then meant the cost of scaling went up. So it was pretty easy to get started. And if you got a good idea, good for you, you can run with it. Oh, but how do you scale your idea? Yeah, okay, that got a little bit more complex. And that's where that complexity is today. So what's happened then is a lot of people, in terms of chasing their returns, they looked at people that had already had some promise. And that's where we came up with these ideas of you needed to have a certain amount of traction, a certain amount of customers, a certain amount of repeat business. Okay, cool. Well, those got your Series A's. Well, then your Series A's got bigger. The problem, of course, with a larger round is that it's going to take you more to get to the next round. You're going to have to produce more. Your bar got set higher. That's always a little bit terrifying for people. So now we have pre-seed rounds. But there's another thing to the pre-seed round that's kind of interesting too. We featured some of them. I mean, you'll have a $150 million fund, a $300 million fund, a $500 million fund, right? Those are the super big funds. And their goal typically over a 3 to 5 year period is to go invest in 25, 30, 40, 50 companies. Great. So what's the pre-seed do? Well, you're finding there's a lot of people that are getting into it now, and they're raising $50 million funds, $40 million funds. Paul, if you have less money, are you going to write bigger checks, or are you going to tend to write smaller checks? You're going to write smaller checks, and you're going to make smaller bets. But what was also interesting to this was they did this group that they showcase in this article. They did an analysis of the modern unicorns. Pinterest, I think they did Airbnb. I feel like they did Google and a couple others. And their initial funding rounds, their A rounds, average size was like between 300 and 600K. And they said, great, that's us. That's what we're going to do. So apparently now that's a pre-seed round. And they said, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to kind of take from that model because it worked. So the words have changed. The concepts have changed, but it still remains the same. And I thought that was kind of interesting. In terms of movers on the week, it was an interesting week in that there wasn't a lot, and yet I think there was a lot. I threw this one in because it came across the wire, and I thought it was interesting. Two companies I wasn't familiar with. Intervision Systems acquired Independent Technology Group. Basically the idea was Intervision does cloud security stuff, right? And the Independent Technology Group did cloud security stuff, and so there you go. One consumed the other, undisclosed. They weren't necessarily side by side, and one of them was backed, venture backed. So it was just kind of like okay, cool. And part of the reason for including this, other than just it came across the wire, was there are a lot of good companies out there, and there's a lot of opportunities. So like when you look at this and say, right, I've got an idea for a company. I don't know what we could ever do. You have options. You always there's a ton of options for capital. There's a ton of options to make it work. There's a ton of options in order to partner with somebody else or in order to join forces. And so that's kind of what I took of that. Prevoty, is that how it's said, Paul?
Yeah, it's Prevoty.
Prevoty. $13 million Series B. All right, that's pretty good. So typically at a Series B, so I'm curious. All right, I know you know the space a little bit better than me. So typically at a Series B, $13 million Series B. So what we're saying is you're pretty good on product market fit, probably a little bit more to go. You've got a team built out, but pretty close on it. And your ability to understand the problem you solve and your unit economics, what it costs for you to acquire a new customer and what it costs for you to keep the customers and deliver the value, you should be pretty close on all of it and getting ready to start massively growing. Would you say that's about where they're at?
I can't really speak to where they're at in that respect. I do know that in application security and what Gartner would call RASP, there are new categories being created. I think that Prevoty and Contrast, although they'll both probably be upset with me for saying that, are in the same category as more of a traditional RASP. I think that Immunio and Signal Sciences are in new categories, likely maybe different or somewhat similar categories, but different from Prevoty and Contrast. And Veracode has a different kind of take on it for like maybe a third or fourth category as well. So it's kind of weird how everyone has a very unique point of view, and all those vendors, even in the same category, they have slightly different points of view in their categories. So as far as me to predict category king, I'll go with our sponsor.
Too soon to tell?
I'll go with our sponsor, Signal Sciences, in that And if you look at Signal Sciences, their growth has been, I think, maybe even better than Prevoty in terms of funding and growth and in revenue. Now, I've got the inside kind of scoop that I can't really share about Signal Sciences. I will say that they're a very strong player in the market, and I've enjoyed doing business with them, and we're going to have some continued success together with Signal Sciences. And, full disclosure, I mean, they're a sponsor, so I have a little more insight into their point of view on the problem, obviously, more so than some of the others. I have taken briefings with most of the other companies, in these various categories. But I'm biased. I like Signal Sciences. But again, our partners are partners because we really like them. We really like their point of view of the problem, right? And the people. I mean, we're in an investment standpoint, right? Like if we're an investment company, I'd be investing in them because I like the people, I like the point of view on the problem. And that's not to say we are
investing in them.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
Just to be fair, right? I mean, the fact that we spend time learning about them and then carrying their message forward and helping people understand that, I mean, that is an investment on our part. And what I'm kind of taking from this too, then, is that this is a space that continues to both be tough to figure out and is getting attention. So I think it's an area that we'll probably continue to focus on in the coming year.
Absolutely.
On that front, so Okta, right, because we talked today about identity and the importance of identity. All right, good for them, right? So they went public. They reported their earnings. They moved their headquarters. And what caught my attention was this line, and then I threw it in from the press release. They launched a free service for startups. All right, so you and I have talked about this, right? So we interviewed Elizabeth Lawler. Mm-hmm. And she came back and she said, you know what? Now that I'm part of CyberArk, we could take this thing that we always had and we can make it open source. Mm-hmm. And you and I were like, wow, that's really kind of novel. Like I dig that. So basically what's happened here is Okta said, look, if you're a startup, the last thing you have to do is worry about how to get it done right. So here's the deal. If you got 25 or less employees, partners, contractors, whatever you're doing, we're going to cover you and we're going to get you started and get your identity done right. And then also, by the way, we'll even help you with your customers. I think it's like up to 2,500 or 25,000. I'd have to look it up on the fly here. But I think that's brilliant. First of all, I like it. That does feel to me like it's giving back. And then think about that. So, Paul, if you get started with somebody like Okta and you're doing really well with them, what's your pain to change off of them down the road?
It's a smart move by Okta. Isn't it? Okta's basically making an investment in startups. In the same way, banking on that a small percentage of them are really going to grow and be great customers, which is going to cover the cost for all the rest of them using it for free. It's just a win all around.
And as you've pointed out too, so they're saying, hey, we're going to help you startup. Oh, and we're going to help you help your customers, right? So it's everything we just talked about. All right, two other pieces to hit quick. Riskonnect acquired Aruvio. The only reason this is interesting to me is because Thoma Bravo is backed up Riskonnect. And if you go back into the Riskonnect stuff, basically earlier this year, Thoma Bravo made their investment and added Riskonnect into their portfolio. Riskonnect is, I don't mean to be rude, because if you just go to the website, it's not exciting. They're typical, like, we help you visualize and handle risk. Oh, great. They need some help on that front. But this is the part I thought was interesting. When you go to the partner at Thoma Bravo, he says, oh, well, we invested in Riskonnect and we realized they needed a GRC platform. So we went on the hunt and we found one that we liked, and now we're going to fold it into them. This is what private equity does, right? I mean, private equity is typically into a little bit of a longer hold, structurally improve whatever the offering is, and then, IPO it, sell it, release it, combine it, whatever. So I think paying attention to what the private equity folks that are big in this space are doing is important. And Thoma Bravo has a pretty extensive holdings in the cybersecurity space, as does the Blackstone Group. In fact, interestingly enough, right? I mean, Blackstone was one of the driving forces that brought Accuvant and Fishnet together, and Optiv is now KKR, but Blackstone acquired Titus. Now, what's interesting is it's reported as they acquired Titus for an undisclosed amount. And then the Globe and Mail up in Toronto said, well, yeah, okay, undisclosed, or $100 million. It's a controlling stake, and the original founders are going to stay, and now they're going to grow. Titus does data classification and categorization. The reason that's interesting to me is it's a set of tools to do it. I feel, Paul, like this is one of those holy grails for the last 20, 30 years of security. If we could just classify information, if we could just categorize stuff better, man, we'd be better off. By the way, haven't we talked about Active Directory in the same way? And haven't we talked about identity in the same way? So when you see Blackstone making a big bet into something like this, I think it's worth paying attention to. It's certainly interesting to me because it's a problem that we know that we have that we haven't really seen a solution to. And I don't know. I'm going to take a closer look at what some of the stuff Titus is doing. But those, to me, like on the private equity side, there were a couple big moves this week, and I thought they were kind of interesting. That's it.
Well, that concludes our program from today. For today, I assume our journeys are going well. We're running short on time, but we'll update you next week on those. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching Startup Security Weekly. See you next week.